September of 2016. A lot has changed since then. So historically in Florida, distillation laws from Prohibition have been like difficult to distill in. That's why most of the distilleries here are a lot younger, within the last 10 years, 10 to 12 years. And so some of the laws have changed. They're all federal, right? Prohibition is what created those federal laws. We're a 3-tiered system. So everything that's distilled is distilled and then paid taxes are paid on that. You don't actually get to call it what you're trying to make until the taxes are paid, and you can actually call it its legal name, right? And then once we sell that to the distributor buys it, they pay taxes, and the distributor sells it to the bar or the liquor store, which has a liquor license, and they sell it to the consumer, which also pays taxes. So the government's like very hands-on, it's federally controlled, and it's been that way since the 1930s, right? So a lot has changed in Florida since then. Historically, Florida used to cost a lot more. The national average is a lot lower than this. So our cost for distilled spirits was $13 for a gallon of 50% alcohol. But they changed that about 2020 during the pandemic. They lowered our cost for a small batch distillery to $2.50, which is a huge break, right? And another one that changed was literally within 6 months of us opening, we used to only be able to sell 2 bottles of one product to an individual in 365 days, right? So you had to take your driver's license down, make sure you're not buying too much. We actually opened knowing that was about to change, so it wasn't a big deal, but hats off to the distilleries that were doing that for a while, like St. Augustine Distillery, which they're touristy, right? They're doing a lot of tours and stuff like that, so they're putting people through once a year. You're not visiting very often, but so it kind of works for them. For us, being inner city Jacksonville, right, we're like looking to be able to make money off of our products, right? So that changed for us. We were able to like open it up. There's no bottle limitations after, I think it was February 2017 is when they signed that in. And then the biggest thing for us was when we got to make, we got to sell you a taste or a cocktail. Before 2021, that was signed in June 2021. Before that, we'd give you a free taste. You know, like we'd sell you a mixer and then, you know, give you a free taste, and if you want to put them together, it's, you know, like we're not responsible for that. So that changed in 2021. And then that's when we came on, opened the bar, so we have the full cocktail menu. The federal government controls pretty much everything, like what you're allowed to distill, you know, like the types of spirits you're allowed to distill. So whenever I'm describing like, you know, your base spirits, you know, everything is like either made from a grain or made from a fruit, right? So, and especially when we get people who buy Groupons and they'll say, oh, I like beer, I like wine. I'm like, well, our final product is a lot boozier than that. But we actually do make beer, and we do make wine, essentially wine, right? And essentially beer, because it all starts out of the grain or it starts out of fruit.
Somewhere along the way.
and then I'll kind of like go through and be like, you know, like talk about, you know, what type of spirits are, you know, made from fruit versus what are made from grain. But the thing that's interesting about America, the US, is that everything that's made here that's sort of popular or mainstream is all grain-based spirits, right? There's a little bit of rum, but most of it's coming from the islands. So we have whiskey, vodka, and gin. Those are the 3 main spirits outside of like tequila, which is made in Mexico, and then rum is coming from the islands, but those are fruit-based, right? So everything really in the U.S. kind of starts out as a beer. So what you're distilling and the product you're distilling is based on your base ingredient. Specifically, whiskey has those laws, right? So every type of whiskey sort of has its, like, if you have bourbon or rye, like bourbon's corn, right? Rye's rye. You know, if you're Scotch, it's made in Scotland, made from single malt. So you're kind of starting out with typically multiple grains, whereas like gin and vodka are like single grain. But I like to tell people it's pretty much all the same stuff, right? We're doing the same exact process for whiskey as we're doing for vodka, as we're doing for gin. It all starts out as a grain. So here's our mash cooker. MC, that stands for the mash cooker. Mash is just the recipe of grains that go into the distillation process. So in our original rye, We have 60% rye, 40% wheat. It's a very large amount of wheat. What sets apart the US versus Canada for whiskey is we mash the grains together. That's the recipe at the beginning. Whereas like Canadian whiskey is all single grain and then they blend it after it's all like barrel aged, right? So this sort of makes us somewhat unique in what we do. Most American whiskeys are blended grains at the very beginning. So we'll cook it down. We don't use malts here. We only use straight grains typically. And then we'll cook it down for a couple hours, pull out those starches, add enzymes to cleave those starches into simple sugars. I have a fermentable product. So 550 gallons of water, about 25 bags of grain, gets cooked down for a couple hours. Lower the temperature. Well, we add enzymes first, kind of break that down. Lower the temperature, and we're gonna add our yeast for fermentation. You'll notice the names on here. We don't have any like official names as a skipper, but like all of our signs have Gilligan's Island name. Yeah, which none of us ever actually call it those names, but I don't know. Somebody.
Was a fan of Gilligan's Island?
I don't know why. I have no idea why we call them those. But anyway, mostly we just call them the mash cooker and the fermenters. But so anyway, we'll pump it from the cooker to the fermenters.
I remember this. I had a cool question about this.
You remember that question?
Yeah, it was. Usually you see fermenters that are cylindrical.
Yeah.
And then I guess, I don't remember if it was you, but you said that it's actually a cylinder in there. It's not actually square like it is here.
Well, actually, it is a square.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah. It's not cylindrical inside. So there's a lot of your beer, like your breweries, are cylindrical. Yeah. I don't know how much, like as far as percentage goes, like whiskey distilleries or small batch distilleries. You'll notice there's no tops on these. It doesn't matter really with fermentation for distilled spirits, at least in our case, because we're just mostly concerned about the alcohol content. Now, that's probably not the same for other distilleries, because some distilleries, especially distilleries that are like coming from brewers who really love yeast, they're like wanting a specific profile from distilled spirits. Believe it or not, the majority flavor profile of your whiskey or your rum all comes from yeast, right? I'd say all comes from, but the majority of the flavor is yeast flavor. So we are specific about what yeast we're using, but we're not super concerned with yeast kind of dropping in. Like if you're in a brewery, a lot more delicate yeast to create more delicate profiles, but they're never gonna have open top fermenters unless they're doing a wild yeasted beer or a Brett beer or something funky, right? That tastes like vinegar at that point, so you gotta be careful with it. You can't let too much in. It can get super aggressive. For us, our yeasts are way more aggressive than those natural yeast, so we don't really see a change in flavor profiles for anything that is dropping into here. And we'll ferment 550 gallons of mash in 3 days. The majority of that fermentation happens within the first 24 hours. And so it starts at about, I think, 11% sugar, down to about 0.5% sugar. In 3 days, we have about a 7% beer. Don't quote me on that. I think it's around 7%. So we'll have our beer in 3 days. It's pretty thick for what you'd expect from a mash. You're not really drinking the beer. This is what's going to happen. You're going to take that beer and you're going to distill it. And we're just more concerned about the alcohol content.
What's the usual alcohol content when it's done?
So what like I said, I think it's around 7%. But like I was taking a whiskey class recently in Canadian whiskey. They do multiple types of enzymes for more sugar content. They were getting up to like 14%. And I don't think that's like typical or average, but I don't have enough knowledge to know that if that's standard for the industry or not. But what I'm assuming is kind of around where we are, somewhere between 7 to 10% alcohol. But I'm not completely sure on that. Once we get full fermentation, it'll stop fermenting in 3 days. There's no point in continuing on. We'll pump it to our still. You have column stills, which a lot of your mass-producing bourbon companies are using, single or double column.
Rums too, man. There's
Rums.
The big rum companies are using stills.
The more plates in a still, the less complex your characteristics, right? You're mass producing, but you're more concerned about volume than you are about the actual flavor characters. So we have a still that has the pot on the bottom and the column on the top, and it doesn't work like a column. It actually works like a pot still. We call it a hybrid still, right? So you're taking your fermentation, your beer, you're putting it into your still, your tank, and you're heating it up. Now, you probably know this, but I always like to kind of describe distillation. Same thing that happens on your stove. You heat up a pot of water, you get steam coming off the top, you put a pot lid on top of that, you start collecting that steam. That's vaporization, condensation, because the pot lid's a lot cooler. So same concept, right? So instead of water, you're doing alcohol, which boils at a much lower temperature. So you can collect alcohol without collecting water. So we put the fermentation into the tank, or the beer into the tank, heat it up. Usually doesn't get much higher than 180 degrees, and you'll start to see that alcohol is making its way up through the column. We have several plates in there, one above each one of these windows that have little bubbles on those plates. So there's holes in the bottom. The vapor will go up through those holes, condense underneath the bubble, and drip down the side. So you've transferred your alcohol content from the bottom to the top of that plate. So it'll go into there's 5 different chambers in there. It'll make its way up, and the further up that column that it gets, the more pure the distillate. But because it's only 5 plates, you're still able to sort of get a lot more character than a column still, which might have 20 to 40, maybe even more plates in there, and you don't really get to choose what you keep. Fermentation does create more than just ethanol, because we're trying to get ethanol, right? That's the majority spirit that we're trying to get, but there's methanol created through fermentation, acetone, chemicals that you don't want to have in your distillate in concentration, right? So we take that out through cuts, and we have like a tank over here if you want to look at that. There's a 3-compartment tank, and it allows you to direct the flow of the distillate to one side or the other. So we'll collect the heads, which is your poisonous compounds, the methanol and acetone that comes off at the beginning. We'll collect it at one side of the tank. We call that heads. As we get through that and it stops smelling like fingernail polish remover, we'll start collecting the majority of our spirits in the middle portion of the tank. That's mostly ethanol, right? That's the good stuff. And then after several hours of distillation, we'll get more into the tails, which are fattier, heavier compounds that take a lot longer to distill off. Those can kind of throw off the flavor of your distillate too. We'll cut those off. Those are called tails. And we keep the hearts, heads, hearts, tails. We keep the hearts, which is mostly ethanol. The biggest difference between vodka, gin, and whiskey is the concentration. Well, vodka and whiskey is the concentration of ethanol, right? So by law, we have to, it's distilled at 95% purity or higher for vodka, right? For whiskey, you cannot distill ethanol higher than 80%, so it's 80% or lower, which kind of describes or gives you an understanding of why whiskey has a bit more character from the grain than vodka does. So quite a bit of that makes it through. Now, tasting it off the still, it still tastes pretty neutral, maybe like tequila or a light rum or something like that. The biggest character of whiskey obviously comes from barrel aging, but that's pretty much any sort of distillate. Distillate is all very neutral until something is done to it.
What do you use your heads and tails for?
We don't use it. We
Throw it out?
more or less get rid of it. Our heads, we used to collect. I think we do some collection, and you can sell it back to the government. They'll refine that. For tails, you can see these tanks here. They have tails. I don't know. Some distilleries will put it back through the still with a bigger portion of it to try and get more alcohol out of it. think we mostly throw it out, but I don't know. These seem to be like we're collecting it. So, but then from what we get, if we're making whiskey, out of 550 gallons of mash to beer, and through the still, we're lucky to get like 10%, 40 gallons is really what we're getting, alcohol that we're getting out of this fermentation, and you're still left with, about 450 gallons of liquid in this that has no alcohol, right? It's just backstillage is what it's called, water and grain, and we don't really do anything with that currently. So yeah, you get a very expensive, or valuable, I should say, a very valuable product in the end. We'll take that middle portion and you add water to it, because you can't sell 95% or 80% alcohol because you'll drink it, right? So we add water to it by law, right? So vodka typically will proof down to 40%. If it's gin, we use a wheat neutral that we run back through with botanicals, and obviously for it to be gin, it has to have juniper. We also do our potato vodka is run back through with citrus. So we make a citrus vodka redistilled with orange, lemon, and grapefruit peels. And that's fresh peels, super cool. And then our whiskey, we're proofing down to somewhere between 115 and 125 to age in a barrel. You can't go over 125 for whiskey. And it's going into a new charred oak barrel. Good example of this is right here.
Before you show us that, what is that that's attached to the top?
It's a gin basket. We don't actually use it. So what I actually, when I first started here, I actually thought that was reflux. I thought it was a
retort?
Yeah, I thought.
Retort.
Yep, I thought that's where reflux came from. But it's actually all for a column. It's all reflux is all on the inside. So you're getting condensation below the plate, and it's dripping down through. So if you look in those little windows while it's distilling, it kind of looks like rain. Like it's like vaporizing and condensing. Whereas you need help for a pot still to get reflux back in, to get distilled spirits out, and reflux will fall back in, but it helps to create more unique characteristics in distilled spirits. So yeah, I thought that's what that was. That's just a gin basket.
Okay.
We that allows vapor from the bottom of the column through. You can direct your already distilled spirit to go through the gin basket, and it'll vaporize the aromatics in there. With our gin, we actually just infuse for a period of time and then throw it in the still and distill, which I think is cool because you can use less botanicals and get more character off it. And we never have had a problem with any like funky stuff coming off of it. Yep. So line arm, and then your cooler condenser. Yeah. Copper condenser.
The equipment that's here made by Vendome, is this custom made or was it bought?
I don't know. No, we bought it directly from them.
So
yeah, and I think most of the stuff is typically custom, but like I think what's happening is most of the time that we're reaching out, our distillery's going to reach out and say, hey, we want this, and then they'll build you something, and then and you could probably even like say how much you want to spend on it. that I'm not really.
What
Sure.
What type of water do you use to proof down?
Good old Jacksonville's finest. we do treat it to take some of the chemicals out, but it's just straight Jacksonville water. It's kind of like RO. Okay. We have a treatment system for it, so. So yeah, vodka, gin, and rum gets proofed down and sent to bottling. Then we have whiskey, obviously, is going to be barrel aged. If you're making a rye or a bourbon in the U.S., well, bourbon has to be made in the U.S., yeah. But if you're making rye or bourbon, it has to be aged in a brand new barrel every single time, right? And the reason is because if you throw a whiskey in here for 5 years and you throw another whiskey in here for 5 years, a lot of those flavors are extracted within the first infusion. And so the second whiskey would look and taste completely different because all the characteristic is out. So for consistency's sake, and to follow the laws of the federal government, has to be a brand new barrel. And it has to be oak There's different types of oak, but a lot of most barrels are made from white oak because they're a lot more flexible. So they change. They're they won't leak as much. You also get a lot more flavor character from the barrel in a shorter period of time. In the state of Florida, there's a lot of humidity, so we actually get a lot faster infusion and a lot more evaporation through time in a shorter period of time. So we have a lot more concentrated flavor in a shorter period of time. So Florida whiskey makes really flavorful, really strong whiskey.
That humid, hot weather.
Yep. Which I would like to say is a terroir.
Yeah.
I call it a terroir. But yeah, so there's two reasons for barrel aging. Obviously, one of them is for flavor and color, and then the second is for allowing it to sit in wood and mellow out. As whiskey sits in wood, you get more fruit characters over time. So a lot of your wood characters come out right at the beginning. Your fruit characters develop over a long period of time. And in Florida, we're kind of like, it's this dance of like, how long do you want to barrel age a whiskey before half this barrel is gone? But you want it longer to be able to get those like delicious fruity characters. So for instance, this top left barrel here, that's an 8-year-old, almost 8-year-old barrel. It's only about a third full. When I was in Scotland, I did a tour in Scotland, and this Scottish, this tour guide was like, he was like making an argument for like why whiskey is so expensive, and he says the reason whiskey is so expensive is you're paying for the whiskey and you're paying for the angels. I'm like, right, that's so true. So we only bring this once it's coming off the still, 160 or 80%, right? Proof it down to 125, 120, and then it'll sit. We make straight rye. Straight rye is an age statement. That means it's being aged a minimum of 2 years. So it'll sit in here for 2 years. I forgot to mention, we do have two main styles of rye that we're making. We're making a wheated rye, so it's 60% rye, 40% wheat, and then we're making 100% rye, which is our rye grain. That's the bottle that you have. Also my favorite. That one's not in distribution, strangely, but it's delicious.
Where are you getting your grain from, the rye grain?
All the rye grains come from Canada.
I think I
There's,
told you that.
well, there's the majority of rye grains that are being used in whiskey are all coming from Canada because they're the best rye grains.
There's some really cool stuff that they're doing with American rye now.
Well, there's unique not single origin, but like unique style ryes that you're finding a lot of your distilleries are doing. Same thing with corn, though. Same thing with corn. Less yield,
Yeah.
so more expensive, right? But yeah.
You say corn, and all I think of is balcones. Because they got
Balcones
so
is-
many different types of rye. I
Mhm.
mean,
Types of corn.
Yeah.
You ever been to Highwire Distillery?
Highwire.
I think it's called
No.
Highwire. I
Where's
think it's in
that at?
South Carolina
No.
or North Carolina.
No.
No, we haven't been to that.
But
Sounds
they
familiar though.
they do like an heirloom corn. It's like a red corn,
Yeah.
specifically for this one whiskey, and it's crazy. It's
Is
really
it the
good.
Butcher red something?
Yeah, it might be. It might be that. It
'Cause
might
I
be
think
that.
Andre gave us a little bit of that. It was fantastic.
Crazy stuff. For barrel aging, it'll sit in a barrel for a couple years for us. And again, like for Florida, we're trying to not lose too much volume. So we kind of stick around 2 years. But a lot of these barrels now are coming around to 4, 5, and 6 years, which is kind of nice. So we're getting some really cool stuff.
These the only barrels you have? Or do you
We have a
other-
warehouse. We have another warehouse
Okay.
that has some of ours, as well as a lot of the other barrels we're doing for, we do several bottling projects, Fine Familiar Spirits. We do their bottling project. We do a lot for Sailbox. So those are all in the warehouse. Lots of barrels there. For us, most of what we distill and keep on hand is kept here, just for the sake of this is what we do and what we have. So
Would you call this warehouse temperature controlled?
I would not.
Okay,
No.
What about the other one?
No, definitely not. Yeah, this one maybe more so, but there's no AC in here. There used to be, but now it's just getting like pretty hot in the summer. So, and there's no cold temperatures. That's the thing is like you're really only seeing a huge difference in whiskey when there's massive fluctuations of temperatures, but in what the evaporation is like a result of the humidity mostly. Like the humidity is insane at all times, and the temperatures, the wood's wide open for like infusion. So we're not like there's no resting period in Florida. It does not.
For long enough.
No.
That looks like what is that? A 2 or 3?
This I think is a 5 char.
5, really?
I think it's a bourbon barrel that this one is.
MGP, so,
Yeah, it's bourbon barrel. So it's a char 5. Most of your bourbons are going through a char 5. Literally mostly just to like make sure that there's no sulfur. Yeah, it'll bond sulfur, as the same thing with copper. That's why you want to have copper for your still. I'll show you the bottling line real quick. Now all these boxes and stuff, this is the Fine Familiar Spirits thing that we're doing. You can see it's like a Dungeons and Dragons theme.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, 4 at a time. We used to bottle on that little guy right there.
Aw.
It was all done by hand until we finally got this thing. I guess about 2 years ago. We gotta prove our proof. So this, like, again, the government's very hands-on. Federal government, not the local government, not state government, but federal government. And so it has to be within 0.3%. So let's say you make vodka, you're making vodka, or you're proofing down vodka, you're bottling it, and then, alcohol and water kind of separate, right? So let's just say you have a different proof at the beginning than you have at the end. And then it goes down to like 39.7. Well, you're technically still within 0.3%. You could call it 40% alcohol. But if you go to 39.6, you can't technically even call it vodka because it has to be bottled at 40%. And then let's say the federal government comes down to your state and your local town and goes to, Total Wine and pulls a bottle off the shelf and tests it. And if it's off, well, you might get in trouble, right? Like you could get your license taken away. You could get you could get fees or fines for not paying the taxes. Ultimately, it's all about the government getting what the expected taxes are, as well as following the rules. So like if you're not following the rules, you get in big trouble, and they'll find out because they'll do an audit, So yeah, ultimately for us,
No, I don't
we
think
want to be able to prove what we're putting into bottles
Yeah.
is what we say we're putting into bottles, so we keep our receipts indefinitely.
Geeky question. Is that calibrated, and do you have to send it out for calibration every so often?
Yep, we do. It's a little sticker here. So yeah, everything is like verified.